and I am a member of the lay community. My background is that I was for some years an ordained minister of the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom, and next to me is my husband, the Reverend Bob Warwicker, a similarly encountered soul. And tonight I've been asked by Adam to introduce the speaker that I have arranged for us to meet. Adam said to me, could you please arrange some Pentecost talks? Now, as we know, Pentecost, it's all about the mixing up of languages and stuff. And there's no one better to unmix languages for us than our guest tonight, who is the Reverend Jane Stranz. Jane is actually a trilingual person at the very least, and could probably do this talk in at least those 3 languages, but she has said she will do it in English for us tonight. Jane and I have known each other, well, and Bob too, in fact, for well over 30 years. And Jane was originally ordained for service overseas by the United Reformed Church. She has probably got a better ecumenical CV than absolutely anyone you've ever met, and has served with various different denominations and organizations, all of them beyond the shores of the UK. So she began with the Reformed Church of France in Dunkirk and in the Pays de Gex. She served for quite a few years with the World Council of Churches, and has more recently returned to Paris, to the parish of Courbevoie. I didn't miss that other thing out on purpose. I just couldn't remember what it was, Jane. And he's currently serving with a Lutheran congregation. So, like I said, you don't get more ecumenical than that. This is proper ecumenism, you know, not just the sort where we stand around being polite and pretend that the fact that we don't give each other the bread and wine doesn't matter. It does. Right. So Jane's going to speak to us tonight about something slightly unusual. You'll have heard of the Rule of St. Benedict. Those of us in the lay community, it's one of the guiding documents, and it's always fascinated me to know what other rules there are about. And Jane introduced me a long time ago to this one called the Rule of Rui, and that's what she's going to speak about tonight. It is a rule for Protestant deaconesses, women who are called to serve in Protestant circles in France, I think, although whether it goes beyond that, I don't know, Jane. You'll tell us. They have been welcoming to Jane, I know, over a number of years. And the Rule of Rui is what we're going to hear about and ask questions about, because I don't know about you, I was asked recently by Adam to write about why I liked Benedict. Well, you know, great men and all that, you can love them or leave them. And so the main reason I like Benedict is because he had a sister called Scholastica. Well, I'll write more about that another day. But the main reason I like the Rule of Rui is because it's actually a rule for women, not one that was written for men that a few women then tried to tart up. So we're going to hear now from Jane on the subject of the Rule of Rui and its origins and what you can do with it. And hopefully, by the end, you'll have all thought of lots of exciting things you want to ask her. And you can do that in the usual way. You can send a chat message to Adam, or you can put up your virtual hand at the end and he'll ask you straight away, I'm sure. So welcome then, Jane, to the somewhat anarchistic, diverse and wacky lay community of St. Benedict. It'll suit you down to the ground, I'm sure. Please unmute yourself and begin to tell us about the Rule of Rui.
So, am I unmuted? Yes, I think I am. Well, thank you, Janet, and thank you to the lay community for inviting me this evening. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk to you both about the Rule of Rui, which is almost impossible for sort of we English speakers to pronounce. It's a bit like those things when they try to get you to pronounce frog in French and you go grenouille or something like that. But Rui, which is actually part of Paris, and also a town somewhere else in France as well. But Revd is where the deaconesses were founded. And I'm just starting by sharing some pictures with you. And these pictures are not in Revd, but in Versailles, where the deaconesses of Revd have their mother house. And they have quite a modern chapel there. And this is just a patchwork of pictures from the chapel that I've taken over the years of going there. And you can see that it's a very modern building. What you can't see is the sound of it all. It's right next to a very, very busy railway station. And for more than 40 years, they didn't have a built chapel. They just had a tent. And the tent was also right next to the railway lines. And over the years, they had to sort of replace the tent once, and then they finally built this chapel. That's a whole other story. And so I suppose the chapel must be about maybe 15 years old now, maybe a little bit older than that. But you can see it's a little bit like a beehive, but it's inside this amazing modern glass structure. And it's made out of woven wood, really. And it has this extraordinary quality where the light shines through it. It is really absolutely lovely. And right next to a railway station, Versailles Chantier. It's in what used to be the poorer part of town in Versailles, but Versailles is still pretty well off, let's put it that way. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the deaconesses. There will be more pictures in a moment, but this is the page that's got a bit of writing on it. I'm going to talk to you about the deaconesses of Revd. And everything that I say about sort of anything is so different from the situation of the churches and of Protestantism that you know from England, from Scotland, from Wales, from Ireland. It is a very, very different situation in France. Protestantism represents, even today, with growing Pentecostal and charismatic churches and migration churches, Protestantism probably only represents 3%, maybe 4% of the population in France. I mean, and that's a really big figure compared with the reality. Anyway, the deaconesses of Revd were founded in 1841 by someone called Caroline Malvezin, who was herself a school teacher, and by a pastor called Antoine Vermeil. And it took quite a long time to sort of get to that stage, but she moved to the suburbs of Paris, or to a part of Paris that was we would call it now a very working class and impoverished part of Paris. It's these days not very far from the Gare de Lyon. If you're ever traveling through Paris, it's quite close by. And originally the deaconesses were founded with a sort of twofold focus: to be a seed of unity in the church and to care for the poor and for those who were forgotten. And in the first instance, it was much more focused on good works, we might say, in more classic, I suppose in Roman Catholic terms, you'd say it was an apostolic community. And it was not a cloistered community in any way. And it was based in Revd. And gradually, over the years, today it's a religious community, more a religious community, but it's also a huge foundation of hospitals. And so there is the community that is one entity, and there's something called the foundation of the Deaconesses Foundation, and that actually is responsible for running a large number of hospitals in France. I won't go into how the healthcare system is structured here, but they are seen as being a good provider of healthcare in the non-profit making sector. There is also a profit-making sector in the French healthcare system, but they're seen as being a good provider in that area. And lots of former Roman Catholic hospitals and healthcare providers join the foundation of the deaconesses because of its governance structures. But that's a whole different story. Anyway, from about the mid-20th century onwards, sort of around about 100 years after the creation of the deaconesses, the focus begins to develop where there is more of a focus on monastic life, on prayer life. That was always there, but in a perhaps a less affirmed sort of way. And the communities always included sisters from a very wide diversity of French Protestant churches. And I suppose the other thing I should just add is that there are also deaconesses quite strongly in Alsace and Lorraine, in Strasbourg in particular, but they're not part of the same thing. Now, some of you may know enough about French history to know that Alsace and Lorraine has not always been part of France. It's gone backwards and forwards between France and Germany, particularly in the 19th century, but also, of course, in the 20th century. And so it was always quite complicated to have any kind of unity between the Alsatian churches, where Protestantism was much stronger than in the rest of France, and any movements or sisterhoods even in the rest of France. But there was this strong emphasis on nursing, social work and education, but also very much open to having Lutherans, Reformed, Baptists, and people from a wide diversity of French Protestantism, which, despite being very small, is also very diverse and quite fragmented in lots of ways, right up until the late 1930s in France, when the Église réformée was formed. But as often happens in Protestantism, when a united church is formed, another church tends to be formed as well. But it's always had strong ecumenical links, and I've just shown you some pictures of the main house in Versailles, and I'll show you some more in a moment. And morning, midday and evening prayer is said there daily, and it is possible to go on retreat there. They've got 4 small hermitages in the garden, but they've also got some rooms in the main house there. And they've also got 5 other places where there are sisters. They've got sisters still in Revd, in just 2 sisters there now. It's a huge institute for training nurses in Revd. There's also Protestant chaplains there, and it's also the base for something that's been running for about 10 years now, something called the Maison d'Unité, which sets up shared housing for a year for young people from different denominations to learn about ecumenism by living it out together. And they also set up training and formation and so on for the young people. And they've now got, I think they've this year got more than 40 young people, students and young professionals involved in that. And it's just been brilliant. And that's really mainly thanks to Sister Benedict, who is just brilliant, and you would love her. And she is so lively and so brilliant. Anyway, they also have a different house here in France. So those are the 2 places in Paris, and then they've got somewhere down in the Moutier Saint-Ouen, which is not far from the Chambon-sur-Lignon, which is quite a well-known place in French Protestantism, and you may even have heard of it. It's where, during the Second World War, a large number of Jewish children were saved, particularly by the Protestants in that area, who knew where all of the old routes in the forests and in the mountains were, and were able to hide a large number of Jewish children there. there's been a couple of films made about it. So they've got a small house there where there are about 4 sisters, and you can also go there, and it's amazing, quite wild part. It's not too far from Clermont-Ferrand, if you can see where that is. And they also have a strong community in Cameroon, a smaller community in French Polynesia, and they have 2 sisters who are involved in a monastery in Norway as well. So they have a certain international presence. As with many religious communities, they are also a very much an aging community, but they do get, and they still are having new people join them. The new people who join them tend not these days to be young people. They may well be women who are divorced or widowed. And they may also be people who come to faith itself much later in life, and so that's also quite interesting. And they've actually got their first novice from an Anglican background, which they're delighted about. They've got quite a large number of people from Germany and from some other European countries, but they haven't had anyone from the English-speaking world, so they're rather pleased about that. And any of you who are specialists in ecumenism may have heard of the Accords of Revd, which is a particularly perhaps rather boring thing to mention now, but they're quite important accords, and they were signed and took the name of Revd. They're the special ecumenical documents which declares communion between the Lutheran and Reformed churches here in France and the 4 Anglican churches in the British Isles, in England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And that's because the meetings took place at the sisters' houses. So let's go on and talk about the rule. So the rule was not written by Caroline Malvezin. The rule is only 40 years old, although the community is now, already nearly 200 years old. Not quite, but it's not far from its 200th birthday. And so this is what the rule looks like. This is a photo of my own copy of the rule. You can see I've obviously been putting hot cups of tea and something on it. You can just see the sort of outline of that on it. But it's a small book. I haven't actually got my copy of it with me this evening because I can't find it because I live in like chaos at the moment. But I'm going to just take you through the rule, and I'll talk about it for about 12 minutes. And what I'll try and do is actually read bits of it out in a moment, but I'll do that in a moment. I won't read them out in French, but I may end up doing some of that. So we'll see what happens. So when you open up the rule, which was written in 3 weeks in one single setting by the prioress or the abbess, if you prefer, but they would call her the prieure of the prieure of the rule. She went away to a hermitage. She was called Sœur Miriam, Sister Miriam. She went away to a hermitage in the Pyrenees mountains, so as far away from Paris as you can get without leaving France, right down on the Spanish border. And she wrote this in 3 weeks. She came back and showed it to the community, and there was a bit of backwards and forwards. She also showed it to Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and a number of Protestant church leaders and people that they were in touch with. And she went away for another week and came back, and that version was signed off and became the rule of the community from 1983 onwards. It's been the rule since November 1983, and so this year it will be 40 years old. And one of the things that I'm basing what I'm talking to you about tonight is this book here, which is a book by someone called Sister Evangeline, who was the person who succeeded Sister Miriam, I think, as the prior of, or the prieur of the community. And she's written a sort of commentary on the rule. And she points to two things about the rule. It's bookended by two doxologies. And so it begins, Holy and Blessed Trinity, glory to you. And then at the very, very end, it goes, to the glory of Christ, King of the universe. And when she writes her commentary on the rule, Sister Evangeline says, at the very end, on the last page of her book, she said, it is a rule to make of he who she who sets out a being of praise. And so it's not a very long book. It's quite nicely laid out. It's a pleasure to have in your hands. And it's laid out so that you can read it slowly as well. So it's not packed onto the page. I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. And so it starts with preliminaries, and then it has 7 chapters, which are both general and specific. The preliminaries are in 7 themes, and I'm actually going to read the preliminaries for you so that you get a taste of what it's like. And then it goes towards an epilogue, and it says, towards an epilogue and the beyond, vers un épilogue et l'au-delà. And that's also got 4 themes to it. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to read it all for you tonight, but I think one of the reasons I like it so much is because I love tweeting. And you can tweet the rule really quite well because it's quite short. And during the pandemic, I started writing prayers morning and evening for my congregation. And I found myself often turning to the rule as a way of saying something, I wouldn't say not necessarily something profound, but saying something that is meaningful, which doesn't sort of need a whole nonconformist sermon. So that's one of the reasons I find it so attractive. And I'm just going to show you now what maybe a page will look like. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you some more pictures. So this is the inside of the I want to put this onto full screen mode, shouldn't I, so you can see it a bit better. This is the inside of the chapel in Versailles. You can see there the blue habits that the sisters wear. They do wear habits. They also wear a Huguenot cross around their necks as well. We'll have a look at that later. I'll show you their website. And this is the building that the chapel is in, and you can see how it reflects the trees that surround it in a really rather wonderful way. It's a very beautiful building. That's what it looks like from one side, as where you can see one of the sisters going into the building here. You can see the cross here. They've got their main houses up at the top here, so they come down this street here towards it, and here's the cross, and this is what it looks like from the inside as you come in through the door. And there are various sort of spaces where you can sit down, and you can have a sense here of some of the way that the light plays on the main building here. And it is a very lovely space. It's a womb-like space, I suppose I'd say. And that's the mother house at the top where the sisters live, in this very large sort of green area, but right next to the railway station. So you can always hear the announcements of the SNCF when you're in the chapel. It's quite fun, really. And this gives you a close-up of the woven wooden structure, and another picture of the chapel itself in the evening. And here we are with the Règle de Reuilly itself. La règle de Reuilly, parole humaine, appel divin. A human word, but a divine call. So that these are words that are written by a human being, by Sir Miriam, by Sister Miriam. And I love the story that it's basically just written in one single inspiration, if you like. She just says, I've always wanted to do this. And Caroline de Malvezin, 140 years earlier, had said, I would so much like to have a rule by which I could nourish myself each day. And finally, 140 years later, it is born by one of her successors. And so this is the very first official page, if you like, of the rule, which I used for the title of what we're saying, of what we're sharing about this evening. And it comes from, not from a Protestant saint, not from a Protestant wise person, but from Patriarch Ignatius IV of Antioch, who was had actually come to Versailles in 1983. And he says, be heaven for your contemporaries. Heaven is in you. And then if you look on the left-hand side there, you can see figures, can't you? You can see les figures, no, you can see numbers, can't you? You can see 1.1 and you can see 2.7. And the rule is such that you can read the whole of the rule twice in 1 year. And 1.1 is the 1st of January. So this is what you read on the 1st of January. And 2.7 is what you read on the 2nd of July as well, because that's when the rule starts to be said again. And it just so happens that the 2nd of July is my birthday. So that has some sort of, I suppose, extra meaning for me as well. So you can see that it's laid out in this sort of way. That's just one page, and you can take your time and you can turn to the next page if you want to. But I thought it would be good for you to be able to see what that looks like. So now I'm going to move us back to just have something like this to look at while I take us through the first 7 bits of the rule. I'm going to read them out. I haven't written the translation beforehand, and that was a decision I made myself, that I would just sort of do it more or less on the fly like this. There is an English translation of the rule. I actually don't own a copy of it. And there's also a German translation of the rule. But I wanted to give you a sense of something that is both finished and unfinished. And I think one of the most important things to know about the rule is that it's not telling people what to do. It's about opening things up. There are specific things that are there for the sisters themselves much more. But I think one of the reasons it's had such a success is that people feel that they can appropriate it for their own needs. So we begin with these 7 parts that open the rule. Be heaven for your contemporaries. Heaven is within you. And then it starts with part that says, this is the rule of holy conduct. Following Christ in thought and by desire, to live in the eternal homeland. For Christ, refuse no service of charity in this earthly exile. And then as we move forwards, we get another quote, this time not from an Orthodox, but from a Cistercian, a Roman Catholic Cistercian called Isaac of the Star. Do not despise anything concerning Christ. Do not concern yourself with anything that is not of Christ. Thirst only for him. And search with desire to serve all where his presence is multiplied. And then we move on to a passage that's called the cornerstone. And this is where we get our first quote from the Bible. So that's one of the things that's quite interesting. This is a Protestant rule, but it doesn't begin with the Bible, which in itself is almost a heresy for French Protestants, possibly for Protestants elsewhere as well. But the first quotation from the Bible is, Écoute Israël, hear, O Israel. It begins with the Shema, which is the Jewish prayer, the Jewish reminder. And then it says, this is the horizon of the journey for your path, Christ of all mercy. And it says, adoration of human activity would be nothing without this quest, which is unique and patient, the quest to follow Christ. And then we move on to a passage that's called Impossible Love. La tendresse des grands spirituels a empli la terre de bonté. The tenderness of the great spiritual people has filled earth with goodness. Their soul was so pure that they saw God everywhere. So I'll let you discover this sort of gradually. I'm only reading you some of the headlines as we go through. And then my very favorite page, almost, I think, my very favorite page is this one. It's about the church. And you might be able to see this. This is what it's just one line about the church. And it says, s'avancer sur des routes d'humilité. Church, going forwards on paths of humility. And that when I think about so much of what our church and our churches are today, I think I've also been commenting on the coronation of King Charles this weekend for French television, and that is such a different picture of what the church is and can be and where we need to be.
We fill the stage week after week.
Someone needs to switch their microphone off. I think. There we go, Michael, I've switched your microphone off for you. And then just three more that I'm going to read for you now. If we were going to choose our place in the body of Christ, perhaps we shouldn't ask to be the eye or the hand or even the ear. Perhaps we should ask, or we should desire to be the joints in the body of Christ. Those places that are hidden, where all sorts of things are articulated, so that we can take our part in Christ's peace, in the depths of this church which is his body. And then the final bit that I'm going to read for you for now, and then towards the end of our time together, I'll read you the blessing that's at the end, is the bit that it talks about the gospel. And this is one of the, I think, most important intuitions that Sister Miriam has brought as a result of writing the rule. Évangile, the gospel. We need not only to love the gospel, to contemplate the gospel, to learn the gospel, to live out the gospel, to suffer the gospel, but more still, with our body and our blood, we need to continue the gospel. Il nous faut continuer l'évangile. So that's my sort of taster for you of the rule of Revd. And I think it's important to try and sort of see it as something you can dip into and dip out of, that different people will find useful at different times in their lives. I know many Roman Catholics here in France very much appreciate being able to read it. And this way that you can read a particular bit for each day of the year is also very much appreciated. And I think people enjoy it from that point of view. And the deaconesses put it, I'm going to stop this screen share and try and share something else with you. If I can go there, perhaps. Not sure that it's on my, no, I can go here. I think it's here. I think I should be able to share that with you now. Let me see if I can manage that. Let's see. Yes, I can. There we are. So this is the deaconess's home screen of their website, and each day the bit of the Règle de Reuil that is destined for this particular day is on their website. This is all about community, the source at which a community slakes its thirst, a community which has at heart to love and to forgive, it says. And here you can see some pictures of the sisters themselves. I think these are particularly joyful pictures of the sisters that you can see here. And they're very, and that's a picture of where they've got their different houses and so on. And there you go. So that's me having given you some bits and pieces from the rule of Reuil for this evening. We can have some questions. I can talk to you a bit more about some of the other things if that's what you'd like. And I will stop the screen share now. And some of you, I had to mute you during that, but you should be able to get your microphones open again, I hope. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was so inspiring. Really quite moving as well to hear those extracts. So I'm just going to throw it open to people to ask.
Can I ask Jane yourself, before you came to the rule of Reuil, did you have another rule you followed? Are you a person who has invested time and energy and so forth in a rule-based discipleship yourself before this, or not? And how does, in your sort of limited one-person experience, how does it contrast with things you have used before?
So I'm talking to you about the rule tonight. I'm a bad user of any of these things. I mean, I do use the rule, but I don't I don't use it religiously, let's put it that way. Now, I am a complete Protestant, yeah. Sorry about that. Particularly, so I think that I would say that my whole life, well before I became, well before I was ordained, I have always been searching for a structure to my spirituality. And I've been failing massively all the time. But for instance, here in Paris, I tend to try and go to Vespers in one of the Dominican monasteries here in Paris, or friaries it would be called. I try to do that at least once a week. I don't always succeed because it's quite a long journey for me now. I'd say I don't necessarily always use a rule. As soon as I have something that's sort of set and is set down, I'll want to go beyond that. But I do find this rule easy to use because I can open it and find something that is right for me now, even if it's not on the day of the year when I'm supposed to be reading that bit. And I also find it very useful for worship, for leading worship as well. It's a very rich resource from that point of view as well.
Yeah, lovely. That's the kind of thing I meant. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Pleasure.
So Jane, I have a question for you. So we are an ecumenical community. On tonight's call, we have United Reformed, Methodist, Catholic and Anglicans all in tonight's call. And so I was really struck by the fact that the rule is used by Catholics and by your evident commitment to ecumenism. I know that your Twitter handle is Ecumenica. I'm a follower of yours, so that kind of, it's what's on the label. It's what's on the label. Do you have any word of encouragement for us in terms of what helps in sort of developing ecumenism as a community?
So I think that one of the key things that French ecumenism can offer to perhaps other parts of the world is a focus on what would be called spiritual ecumenism. You may have heard of someone called Paul Couturier, who was very much involved in France in promoting the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, but who also set up the Groupe des Dombes, which is an ecumenical group that's relatively well known. I'm a member of that as well. And we do sort of write theological texts and things. But the most important thing we do together when we meet once a year is that we pray in a monastery with the sisters in the monastery where we meet. And thinking back to my time at the World Council of Churches, and this might help or might not help, I'm not sure. It's also a response to what Janet was saying. I have no idea whether prayer works. You know, I mean, I have no proof that because I prayed for something, it happened. But I do know that prayer brings us together and places us before God. And it is something, for the most part, that Western Christians can do together without too much trouble. We still need to be careful about assuming that our way of doing things is the way that everybody does things. I was chair of the worship committee at the World Council of Churches for a number of years, and we met in the chapel every morning. There were only very few of us there, I have to say, on Tuesdays to Fridays, a few more earlier on in the week. But I think I believe in the faithfulness of just getting on and doing it, however you manage to be able to do it. And that's what I would encourage you to do. But I also think that and I think Conrad Reiser, one of the former WCC General Secretaries, would say this: the ecumenical space is a different space. It's not your space. It's not my space. It's a space that is quite different, and we bring to it our different riches from our different traditions. But we need to be careful about assuming that because we do this in this way, that will be the way that other people will be doing it. And it's a constant challenge to be open to the other, to be attentive, but also not to let go of that which is precious for us. And so praying together is quite a contested space as well. I'm just thinking about how back at the beginning of the 2000s, the Orthodox churches in the World Council brought in this idea of common prayer rather than ecumenical common prayer rather than ecumenical worship, because that was problematic. And even here in our local ecumenical group, the Orthodox priest joins in with things, but he does not come to ecumenical prayer, and he will not join at the front if we're standing in our different sort of robes and being visible together. He won't do that. And some Orthodox priests will, others won't. And we need to be attentive to that as well, even if it's not what we would choose to do ourselves. But I would encourage you to simply just go on praying and learning from one another, and testing and using the ecumenical possibilities as something fresh. It's a new space always. The ecumenical space is always moving and always different, whereas our own denominational or confessional spaces tend not to move in quite the same sorts of ways. Don't know if that helps, but
Thank you. That was very helpful. Very, very helpful indeed. Grace, have you just appeared up at the top left? Did you have a question which you wanted to ask? It may just be the vagaries of Zoom. Sorry, it's just, oh, Barbara has a question. You have to unmute, Barbara.
Yes, I do. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. My question relates to your outreach and mission to others. You talked about the nursing, the vocation there, and help others. I just wondered I don't know if expectation is the right word, but whether all members of your community, as well as their prayer life, whether there's a hope and expectation that they use that to follow the charism of the community for the benefit of the others.
I should just add, thank you very much, Barbara. I should add, I'm not a member of the community. I'm an ally, perhaps, of the community. I go there, but I'm not a member of the community, and I'm not even a member of. I'm not even an oblate of the community. I follow the rule as I am able to, and as I feel moved to. One of the interesting things is that there are several Roman Catholic oblates in the community. One of the things, as there are fewer women coming forwards to be deaconesses, one of the things that happens is that there's not the same focus on service in hospitals as there used to be. And this is something that quite a lot of Roman Catholic apostolic communities are going through as well, that those vocations are lived out in a very different way today, and women in particular may remain single but will be working in other areas. And today the deaconesses are not the sisters themselves are not necessarily present in the hospitals that carry their names, but they do try to make sure that there are Protestant chaplains in all of the hospitals that they are involved in. And here in the town where I'm a minister, we have 2 hospitals that are linked to the deaconesses that were founded by them in the middle of the 19th century, very much influenced by Florence Nightingale as well. That whole sort of period, she learnt a great deal while training in Germany, Florence Nightingale did, but also had quite an important impact on other sort of movements within different Christian denominations. So I'd have to say that the crisis of vocations is there, but that doesn't mean that there's possibly more focus on mission. There's a strong mission in terms of palliative care. The deaconesses have led the way in lots of ways in palliative care, which is a big issue in France at the moment, as the euthanasia bill is being discussed in Parliament at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. I think declining vocations is a challenge, certainly in the Western world, which is difficult for everybody.
French Protestantism has tended not to be very strong in Vietnam, for instance. And I know from my Dominican friends that they would not have any kind of problem with vocations if they took everyone who claimed to be interested in becoming a Dominican from Vietnam, for instance, from Asia. So I think we're living in interesting times. I mean, managing decline is not easy, but it's about choosing life in all of these situations. And the chapel is beautiful. Perhaps there won't be any deaconesses to pray there in the future, but you build it in the hope and you trust that someone else will use it and pray there, or that someone else will pick up the rule and pray it and find that it's useful. I'll say something about that right at the end, actually.
Good. So we have Derek. Would you like to ask your question, Derek?
Yes, thank you. In the extracts from the rule that you read, there was clearly a great deal for individual reflection. And we find the same thing in the rule of St. Benedict, that there is a lot there to think about. But life in community is not just there's involved a structure and a discipline. And how does the rule deal with that, the tensions of living together? I mean, St. Benedict would have bashing with the rod or excommunication and things. So how does this more modern rule deal with living together?
They have a constitution as well as a rule, let's put it that way. There are some quite important things about gossip and about facing aging, which I think was quite prophetic of Sister Miriam at the time. Of course, already in the 1980s, she could see that people were living much longer. And we tend to know that monks and nuns tend to live the longest of all as well, proportionately. So there are quite a number of things about how obedience is practiced towards the prioress as well, but also the intergenerational aspects of living together within a small community where age differences may be very big, and also about not letting doubt overcome you about life and so on. So there's some quite strong bits about community life within the rule, but again, they are for personal reflection rather more. they're not quite, I do know the rule of St. Benedict. I have read it on several occasions. I'd say that they're not imbued in quite the same way with a desire to structure things. And that, I think, may be something that a woman writing a rule for a female community has, I mean, and a Protestant community, that's certainly formed the thinking, but there isn't the same need to have the structural parts that you find in the rule of St. Benedict. There's nothing about excommunication in the rule, although sisters do leave, of course, and sometimes it's important to find a sister who is unhappy, a flat to live in outside the community for a while, but there's also some, I mean, I'd say more general advice on things rather than, yeah, it's less inspired by canon law and, well, I mean, not that canon law quite existed in the same way in Benedict's time as it does now, but there's not that same concern about structuring something that Benedict had, which is of his time as well, even if it finds an echo in the way that things are organized now. I mean, I know a little bit about how Roman Catholic communities are structured and the differences between them for various reasons to do with working, well, I studied in Rome for a while together with quite a lot of people in charge of Roman Catholic communities. So I think that's different in this rule compared with the Benedictine rule. And I mean, the Benedictine rule is more sort of, a bit more in your face, I'd say, probably than the rule of Revd.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one more question. If there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question before we close off tonight. I've got one I'd love to ask, but if anyone else wants to go. You touched something in my heart just then, Jane, when you said about, remind us that this rule was written by women, for women. Do you think that there's any message that comes from it to the way that we structure our churches, coming from that feminine perspective?
I would call it a female perspective, perhaps, rather than a feminine perspective. But I don't know, to be honest. I haven't thought about it from that point of view. But I am a feminist theologian as well, so I should do, shouldn't I? And I think that lots of, I don't know if any of you have read a theologian called Grace Jansen. She died in the early 2000s. She wrote a seminal book on Julian of Norwich, but she was in the middle of writing a sort of 6-volume treatise on trying to completely rethink the philosophy of religion, really. And Grace Jansen says, we are natal, we are not mortal. She became a Quaker fairly early on in her Christian journey, and very much about peaceability, but also about refusing to always think about things in terms of war, of exclusion, of getting rid of, about seeing, basically having the triumph of death, really anchored in many ways in our Christian theology, at the same time as we preach resurrection. And so she kept on insisting that we need a Christian philosophy of being natal rather than mortal, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't concentrate on the finitude of life, but not concentrate on the finitude, but always concentrate on the possibilities of life. And I think that is where this rule also goes, I would enjoy trying to read this sort of in a Grace Janssen type way, maybe, and see that actually there's a lot here that gives us this sense of something that is always becoming, en devenir, and it's always a path forwards, and not a path of destruction at any stage. And we'll see that with the final blessing that I'll read for you in a moment. But
thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. So I'm going to hand back to Janet now, just to close off the evening. Before I do that, can I just say a huge thank you from me and from the community, and to say that you have been le ciel for us tonight. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I knew it'd be fascinating, and you and I have promised ourselves we'll go there together to Versailles one day, but you know, many reasons why we've not done that yet. And I hope that it has piqued some interest, not because I think lots of you will want to go and read this rule or whatever, but just so that you should know there are other rules out there.
Yeah.
And they look very different from ones you might be familiar with, and that even Protestant deaconesses have got rules. And you know, there's a whole world of stuff that's just mind-blowingly, you know, a glass house where you can see the trees on the outside, both from the outside and the inside. I mean, what is that about? You know, woven bits of wood. It's just bonkers and crazy and totally wonderful. So I hoped that there'd be some sort of thing there. I was very struck by what you said, Jane, about your ecumenical space, and that it doesn't belong to anyone. And I would really emphasize that from some conversations I've taken part in with some of you. Ecumenical space does not belong to anyone. So I think that was a very, very helpful thing to hear you say, and I'd like to very much explore how that might influence our journey forward. And yeah, thanks. It was everything I hoped it would be. The one thing you didn't do was show us your Huguenot cross. You didn't get, no, you didn't go all Huguenot on us, which is a shame, because that would have been an interesting sideline as well. But it's been great, and there's never enough time to do all the things you want to do on these things anyway. We're very grateful to you for joining us, and all those people, including those who came in the middle of the night from the other side of the world and all of that kind of thing. And we hope that we will have more opportunities to explore such things another time. Thanks so much for that. Just to remind you, everybody, that you do get more anarchy. Yes, more reformed anarchy coming up in 2 weeks' time. You get a week for Ascension. You can go and ascend in whatever way you prefer, and then come back the following Thursday, the 25th of May, to hear Reverend Dr. Graham Adam of the Congregational Federation. Now, there's a rump of Reformation history for you. Talk about holy anarchy. Wow, go on, go for it. It's 7:30 in 2 weeks' time. Meanwhile, Jane, you're going to finish.
I will finish, and I should also just add 2 final things. When the deaconesses were set up by Caroline Malvezin, you can see other forms of monasticism also emerging in French Protestantism. One of them has just celebrated its 100th anniversary only, something called La Fraternité des Veilleurs, which was set up by Wilfrid Monod. And so there's also another form of monasticism that is only lay monasticism, and is just basically completely diffused within society. Anyway, here is the sending that ends the book, or that is the last bit in the book. Envoi. Serve the Lord. Serve present time. Serve the time of the present. Be attentive to this time. Be a benediction for the women and men of this time. Bless the Lord. Bless the men and the women of this time. Serve the Lord. Do good before the people of this time and with the people of this time. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.